The Galactic Council declared, "You harmed human children, now your entire lineage ends." The data chip was already in my hand when the doors of the Grand Conclave opened, and I walked inside knowing that nothing in the chamber would ever be the same again. My name is Caroline Reyes. I am the senior diplomatic representative of Earth to the Galactic Council, and I had spent 11 years in this role learning how to be patient, how to be quiet, how to let things go. I had learned to smile at creatures who had no concept of smiling. I had learned to bow to beings who had no waist to bend. I had learned to sit still through 6-hour sessions conducted entirely in subsonic pulses, listening to translated summaries in my earpiece while my back ached and my coffee went cold. I had been patient for 11 years. That morning, I was done being patient. The Grand Conclave of the Galactic Council was not a room. It was a statement. It was a chamber carved into the interior of a hollow asteroid, 2 kilometers across, lined with tiered balconies that held the sealed environmental pods of over 200 species. The air in the center where I walked was neutral, breathable for humans, tolerable for most carbon-based delegates, and frankly unpleasant for everyone. The light was dim and blue, by tradition, because the founding species of the Council had evolved in deep ocean darkness and had never fully updated the aesthetics. I had always found it oppressive. Today I found it fitting. The session was called an emergency arbitration, which in Council language meant that someone had filed a formal grievance so serious that the standard 6-month scheduling process had been bypassed. The request had come from Earth. From me, specifically, at 3:14 in the morning, station time, 41 hours after the security footage from Meridian Station arrived in my inbox. I had watched the footage once. That was enough. The chamber filled in the way it always did, slowly, with great ceremony, with the kind of deliberate slowness that reminded every attending species that the Council was ancient and permanent and unhurried. Thousands of delegates in their pods and platforms and pressurized tanks settled into place. The atmospheric readouts stabilized. The translation networks hummed to life. High Speaker Vorith of the Vethkai was already seated at the opposing dais. The Vethkai were gaseous beings, not in the science fiction sense of being made of gas, but in the sense that they lived and breathed and thought best in a dense methane-nitrogen mix, and their containment spheres moved through the air with a slow, floating dignity that I had once found beautiful. Vorith's sphere was larger than the others. He was the oldest of the current Vethkai delegation, a creature who had been in this chamber for over 300 council cycles. He had seen civilizations come and go. He had seen complaints filed and dismissed. He had seen species throw fits and storm out and come crawling back when they needed trade licenses renewed. He looked at me with the bioluminescent equivalent of mild interest. I set the data chip on the podium. I did not look at my notes. I did not look at the ceiling, or the walls, or the assembled witness of 4,000 delegates from 200 species. I looked at Vorith, and I waited until the translation network confirmed full connectivity, and then I said what I had come to say. 11 days ago, a Vethkai trade delegation made port at Meridian Station, registered as a standard commercial transit stop. What I am about to show this council is the security footage from Sector 7 of that station, which contains the residential and educational facilities for the families of deep space workers. I will ask that this footage be entered into the permanent record. I will ask that it be distributed in full to every member species of this council. I will ask that it be viewed without interruption. I pressed the chip into the podium's interface. The footage played on the central display that every delegate in the chamber could see. It was 47 minutes long. I do not need to describe in detail what was on that footage. What I will say is this: it showed 11 children, ranging in age from 6 to 12 years old, being taken from a supervised recreational space by figures in Vethkai environmental suits. It showed those children being moved to a sealed cargo bay. It showed them being sedated, categorized, and physically examined by Vethkai researchers with instruments designed for non-human biological sampling. It showed them being labeled. Not named. Labeled. The footage ran for 47 minutes, and I stood at that podium for every second of it, watching the chamber instead of the screen. The Telhari delegates, who were insectoid and mercantile and generally expressive in a way that other alien species sometimes found alarming, went completely still within the first 2 minutes. A Mirati elder, one of the ancient ocean-going intelligences who almost never attended in person, had sent a physical representative for this session, a thing that happened perhaps 4 times per century. That representative did not move for the entire duration of the footage. Voritha's containment sphere pulsed once, slowly, at the 11-minute mark. He did not pulse again. When the footage ended, the chamber was so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of my own earpiece. No one spoke. No one transmitted. The translation network, which usually buzzed constantly with cross-species commentary, was silent. I let the silence sit. I let it fill every corner of that 2-kilometer chamber. I let it press against the walls and the balconies and the tiered pods of 200 species. Then Vorith spoke. His voice, translated, was calm. Measured. Ancient. He used words like context and misunderstanding and isolated incident. He used the phrase complex interspecies regulatory frameworks. He said that the Vethkai Trade Science Division had been operating under an outdated research classification protocol that had not yet been updated to reflect the Council's Provisional Species Addendum of 80 years ago. He said that the children had been returned unharmed, he used the word unharmed, and that the Vethkai Conclave deeply regretted any distress caused to the families involved. He then used a phrase that I had been waiting for, and half dreading, and half hoping he would say out loud in this chamber in front of 4,000 witnesses. He called the children subsapient developmental specimens. He said it carefully. He said it as part of a longer legal sentence. But he said it. And the chamber, which had been quiet, went quieter. I waited until Vorith finished. I gave him the full courtesy of uninterrupted speech. I did not react. My face was still, my hands were flat on the podium, my breathing was the slow and even breathing of someone who had decided, many hours ago, what they were going to say next. All 11 children had been recovered alive. One, a 7-year-old named Danica Osei, had not yet woken up. She was in a medically induced coma on Meridian Station when I boarded the transport that brought me here. Her mother had asked me, in the corridor outside the medical bay, whether anyone was going to do anything. I had told her yes. I had meant it. When Vorith finished, I looked at him for a long moment, and then I looked at the 4,000 delegates in the chamber around us, and I said 7 words. I am not here to ask for justice. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. It was the kind that meant everyone in the room understood that something had already begun, and no one was quite sure what it was yet. I let them wonder for exactly 3 more seconds. Then I kept talking. Captain Nora Calloway had not slept in 42 hours, and she was not planning to sleep for at least 12 more, and she was completely fine with that. She sat in the command chair of the Earth Fleet ship Unbroken and looked at the star map on the display in front of her with the focused calm of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of moment for 15 years without ever quite believing it would actually arrive. She was wrong to doubt. It had arrived. The Unbroken was not the largest ship in the Earth Fleet. It was not the newest, or the most heavily armed, or the most decorated in terms of commendations and battle ribbons. What it was fast, and what its crew was thorough. Nora had chosen every member of her senior team personally over the course of 3 years. She had chosen them not for toughness or for aggression, because she could hire those qualities anywhere. She had chosen them for patience, for precision, and for a particular kind of cold, methodical intelligence that she privately thought of as the human superpower that other species consistently underestimated. Other species could be smart. Other species could be fast, or strong, or ancient, or capable of perceiving 17 dimensions of reality that humans could not. But there was something specific that humans did with an unfair problem, something in the deep wiring of the species, something that had been refined over 10,000 years of being smaller than other things and surviving anyway, that Nora had come to think of as the long way around. When you could not win directly, you found the long way around. She had given her crew 48 hours from the moment Ambassador Reyes filed the emergency arbitration. 48 hours was what she had. What her team did with those 48 hours was, she thought with quiet satisfaction, close to perfect. Lieutenant Owen Marsh was her intelligence analyst, which was a title that did not begin to cover what he actually did. Owen was 29 years old, had never in his life raised his voice above a conversational level, and could trace a financial record through 40 layers of interspecies bureaucracy the way some people solved crossword puzzles, with obvious pleasure and a cup of tea. It was Owen who had found the violations. Not human violations. Not claims that the Vethkai had done something wrong according to human law or human values. That argument would have been too easy to dismiss. Vorith and his delegation had clearly prepared for it, prepared the contexts and the frameworks and the regrettable addendum protocols that would make human outrage look parochial and premature. What Owen found was Vethkai violations of Vethkai treaties. He had started with the Council's public registry, which contained every trade agreement, colonial charter, environmental compact, and diplomatic memorandum that any species had ever filed with the Council. It was a vast archive, the kind that most species assumed existed without ever actually digging into it. Owen had spent 18 months quietly building a search system designed to cross-reference the Vethkai's own filed commitments against their recorded activities. He had not originally been building it for this. He had been building it because he found archival work genuinely interesting, which was perhaps the most human thing about him. When the Meridian footage arrived, he looked at what he had built, and he understood immediately what it was for. In 48 hours, working with two junior analysts named Priya Goswami and Dale Finch, Owen produced a document. It was 340 pages long. It contained 130 separate violations of Vethkai signed treaties, cross-referenced against Council activity logs, trade route registries, and colonial survey data going back 112 years. Each violation was time-stamped, sourced, and accompanied by the specific clause in the specific treaty that the Vethkai's own representatives had signed and then ignored. Not all of the violations were major. Some were administrative, missed reporting windows, incorrectly classified cargo, environmental survey data that had been submitted late or not at all. Owen had included those deliberately, because the weight of 130 items was different from the weight of 30. But many of them were significant. 13 involved disputed resource extraction in systems belonging to other Council species. 7 involved transit through restricted corridors without authorization. 4 involved biological sampling activities in protected zones. Owen had flagged those 4 with a small note in the margin that read, "Precedent." At 4 o'clock in the morning, station time, 3 minutes before Ambassador Reyes began her opening statement, the Unbroken's communication system transmitted the full 340-page document simultaneously to the secure diplomatic inbox of every Council member species except the Vethkai. Every single one. At exactly the same time, the Unbroken moved. Not aggressively. Not in a way that would trigger a defensive alert or a weapons lock or anything that could be characterized as a provocation. The ship moved, smoothly and at legal transit speed, into a position along a registered shipping lane that happened, entirely by coincidence, or at least by coincidence that would be extremely difficult to disprove, to sit directly between the Vethkai homeworld and the gas giant Prethkav, which was the primary source of the energy compound that powered 70% of Vethkai industrial activity. The Unbroken then turned on its running lights and stopped. It did nothing else. It simply sat there, legally, in a registered transit lane, with its lights on, broadcasting standard navigational identification signals, going nowhere. Nora had explained to her crew, when she outlined the plan, that there was a concept in human history called leverage. Not force. Leverage. The difference between the two was precision. Force broke things. Leverage moved them. The Unbroken was leverage. Back in the Grand Conclave chamber, Nora knew Caroline Reyes was standing at a podium saying 7 words. She knew because they had planned it together, in a 2-hour call 46 hours ago, with a star map between them and coffee on both sides. Nora watched the clock on her display count down. At the 53-minute mark of the conclave session, her communications officer, a young woman named Bex Hargrove who had the remarkable ability to monitor 14 channels simultaneously while appearing completely relaxed, said quietly, "The Telhari trade representative has left the chamber." Nora nodded. Expected. The Mirati elder representative has requested a data transfer of Owen's document to 3 additional Mirati analysis teams. Also expected. A pause. Then, Vethkai diplomatic channel is requesting our registry identification and purpose of transit. Nora looked at the star map. She looked at the gas giant on the display, and the thin legal line of the shipping lane, and the Unbroken sitting perfectly still in the middle of it. "Tell them we are conducting a scheduled navigational calibration exercise," she said. "Standard protocol, estimated duration 72 hours. Beck sent the response. Another pause. "They're asking if we can move to a different calibration position. Tell them we have selected this position specifically because of its distance from gravitational interference and we appreciate their concern for our navigational safety." Beck sent that one with what Nora privately thought was excessive composure for a 26-year-old in the middle of the most significant diplomatic action in human history. Owen appeared at Nora's elbow. He was holding his tea. The Rithosai observer on the council has requested a private encrypted line to the ambassador's communications team, he said. Nora looked at him. The Rithosai reached out. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The Rithosai were aquatic, ancient, and almost never spoke in open council sessions. They were one of the species that the Vethkai had historically traded with most extensively, in the older part of the last century. Forward it to Reyes's team, she said. Flag it priority. Owen nodded and went back to his station. Nora looked at the star map for another long moment. Then she looked at the gas giant Prethkav, sitting enormous and distant and orange on her display, the lifeblood of a civilization that had decided 11 children were specimens. She thought about what Caroline was saying right now, 40 light-years away, in a chamber full of ancient beings who had never quite understood what humans were actually made of. She thought about the document Owen had built. She thought about the Rithosai requesting an encrypted line. She thought about the Telhari delegate walking out of the chamber without a word, which was not what a species did when they were angry. It was what they did when they were quietly recalculating. She finished her coffee. Bex, she said. Captain. Get me a line to Ambassador Reyes when the session breaks. Tell her the package has been delivered. Tell her the package is sitting in everyone's inbox and no one is deleting it. Yes, Captain. Nora settled back in her chair and looked at the running lights of her own ship reflected on the display screen. 48 hours. They had done it in 48 hours. She thought about what Caroline had said to her on that call, almost 2 days ago now, with the star map between them and the footage still raw. Reyes had said, other species think we escalate. They think we get emotional, we get reactive, we get loud and then we get tired. They think we operate in bursts. They have never understood that what looks like a burst to them is just the part they can see. They never see what we do in the quiet hours before. Nora had said, they will now. Reyes had said, yes. They will now. 3 days into the hearings, a Vethkai counselor named Prethsovan, who was younger than Voreth by about 4 centuries and smarter than him in ways that were starting to show, sent a formal written request to Ambassador Reyes asking for a private meeting. He did not call it a negotiation. He called it a conversation to better understand the human perspective on path-forward options. Caroline filed the request in a folder she labeled Not Yet and went to bed. She slept for 8 hours, which was more than she had slept in any of the previous 92, and when she woke up she felt clear. The kind of clear that comes after a long time of being the opposite. The third session of the conclave was already waiting for her. She walked in wearing the same style of diplomat's uniform she always wore, dark blue, formal, with the small gold earth seal on the collar. She sat down at the human delegation's table, accepted a cup of tea from her aide, a steady young man named Patrick Lorne who had been her shadow for 4 years and had the extraordinary quality of never asking whether she was okay when it was obvious that she was not, and looked at the chamber. Something was different. It took her a moment to identify it. Then she understood. 3 days ago, when she had walked in with the data chip, the energy of the chamber had been the politely watchful energy of a body that expected to adjudicate a complaint. Today it was the energy of a body that had been reading a 340-page document for 72 hours and had thoughts. Voreth was in his place. He looked, to Caroline's experienced eye, exactly the same as he always looked, which in the Vethkai was a significant effort. She stood at the podium and she began. I want to talk to this council today not about what the Vethkai did, she said. I want to talk about what humanity is, and what humanity remembers, and why those two things matter to every species in this chamber. She paused. She let the translation network carry those words into 200 different forms of understanding. Humans are a young species by council standards. We have been spacefaring for less than 200 years. We have been council members for 30. There are individual delegates in this chamber who are older than our entire industrial civilization. I know this. We have never pretended otherwise. She looked at the chamber. She looked at the Telhari pods, and the Mirati representative, and the Rithosai environmental tank that she had noticed 3 days ago was positioned slightly closer to the human delegation's table than it had been before. What I want to explain, she said, is what it means to be human and young. Because I think some of you have misunderstood it. I think some of you look at our age and see inexperience. I think some of you look at how recently we arrived here and think we have not yet learned the cost of silence. And I want to correct that misunderstanding, because it is doing you harm. She opened the small document on the podium in front of her. It was not a legal brief. It was a history book, a specific selection of human history, chosen with care. I am going to tell you about some things humans did to each other, she said. Not the things we are proud of. The other ones. And then I am going to tell you what happened to the people who did them, and how long it took, and what eventually became of them. She talked for 90 minutes. She talked about civilizations that had decided some people were less than people, and what eventually happened to those civilizations. She did not need to name any alien species. She was talking about humans. She was talking about human history, human failure, human cruelty, and human consequence. But the chamber understood. You did not need to be human to understand patterns. She talked about record keeping. About the human obsession with documentation, with evidence, with making things permanent on paper and stone and hard drive and cloud server. She explained that humans had developed this obsession not because they were naturally organized, but because they had discovered, repeatedly, over thousands of years, that the most powerful thing you could do to someone who had done wrong was to make sure the record of what they did could not be erased. Not as punishment. As history. Because history, for humans, was not something that faded. It was something that followed. We invented libraries, she said. Not for comfort. For memory. Because we understood, earlier than almost any other experience taught us anything, that the most dangerous thing in the world is a wrong that has been forgotten. She paused. Danica Osei is 7 years old, she said. She woke up 4 days ago, and the first thing she asked was whether anyone had done anything. I told her yes. I am now explaining to this council what yes means. She set down the history book. Yes means the record. Yes means the permanent, searchable, unremovable record, filed in the council's own archives, which belong not to any one species but to all of them, retrievable for as long as this council exists, which we are told will be longer than any of us can calculate. Yes means the name. Not just the action. The name. Vorith spoke. His voice, translated, was careful in the way that very old things are careful when they feel the ground shifting. He invoked historical precedent. He named the culling accords of the Saravani, a negotiated amnesty from 600 years ago. He named the forgetting protocols established after the Hreth conflicts. He spoke about the Council's long tradition of restorative diplomacy and civilizational grace. He was, Caroline acknowledged privately, very good. He had clearly had help from legal scholars who had spent the last 72 hours preparing this argument. She waited until he finished. I am familiar with those precedents, she said. They are the reason I chose the course of action I chose, instead of a different one. Because every precedent you have cited was a council action. A vote. A decision made by this body to extend a formal grace to a civilization that asked for it. She looked at Vorith. We are not asking the council to act. We have already acted. We are here as a courtesy. The chamber was very quiet. The document distributed to every member species 3 days ago has already triggered automatic review clauses in 7 separate treaties. I say automatic because that is the correct word. Those clauses do not require a vote. They do not require a resolution from this body. They were written into treaties by Vethkai legal representatives who agreed to them, signed them, and registered them with this council. The clauses activate when certain documented thresholds are met. The document my team compiled met those thresholds. The review processes are already running. She let that land. Vethkai colonial operations on 3 systems are in legal suspension as of yesterday morning. This will continue through the review period, which will take between 6 and 18 months, during which time the affected systems cannot engage in new resource extraction, cannot enter new trade agreements, and cannot access council dispute resolution mechanisms for any grievances of their own. This is not a punishment we imposed. This is a mechanism the Vethkai themselves agreed to, in writing, when they signed into the Council's Commercial Regulation Framework 140 years ago. Vorith was still. His containment sphere, which usually moved in slow, breathing pulses, had not moved in several minutes. What we are asking from this council, Caroline said, is something very specific. We are asking for a formal declaration, entered into the permanent record, naming the Vethkai governing dynasty of the 7th Conclave as responsible for a documented violation against human children aboard Meridian Station. The declaration does not need to be punitive. It does not need to contain legal penalties or political sanctions beyond what is already running through the treaty review process. It needs to contain the truth, clearly stated, on the permanent record. She looked around the chamber. That is all. We want the truth, on the record, with a name attached to it. Because humans, as I have explained, understand the value of names attached to truths. We have understood it for 10,000 years. It was then that the Rithosai tank moved. Slowly, deliberately, in the way that creatures who have been still for a very long time move when they finally decide to stop being still. The Rithosai delegate turned to face the central podium. The request to speak transmitted through the council system, and the chamber recognized it, and gave it priority, because the Rithosai had not requested open floor time in 46 council sessions. The voice that came from the tank was deep and resonant and slightly too low to be entirely comfortable in human ears. The Rithosai Collective, it said, would like to make a supplementary statement to the record. Caroline stepped back from the podium. She had not known this was coming. Not for certain. She had guessed, when she saw the request for an encrypted line 48 hours ago. She had hoped. But she had not built her plan around it, because she did not build plans around what other species would choose to do. She built plans around what humans could do. If others chose to join, that was their decision, made freely, which was the only way it could mean anything. The Rithosai spoke for 22 minutes. What they said changed the hearing. The vote was scheduled for the 5th day of sessions, and by the time it arrived, the chamber was a different place than the one Caroline had walked into carrying a data chip. She sat at the human delegation's table with Patrick beside her, his steady presence she had come to rely on more than she ever acknowledged out loud. The council chamber was full, which was not always the case for votes. There were usually abstentions, proxies, delegation seats held by automated systems for species too distant to send physical or near-physical representatives. Today, nearly every position was occupied. People were paying attention. That was already something. Prethsovan, the younger Vethkai counselor who had requested a meeting she had not yet given him, was seated beside Vorith. In the 72 hours since Caroline's third session address, she had watched Prethsovan through the chamber's open feed with a quiet, analytical attention. He had spoken to 7 other delegations privately. He had requested access to Owen's compiled document twice through official channels. He was, she thought, not stupid, and he understood what a vote lost in this chamber would mean in a way that Vorith, who had seen so many things survive so many hearings, perhaps did not quite feel yet. But the vote was the vote. She had counted it. Her team had spent the last 2 days doing nothing else. The Telhari had committed their votes. 23 of them. That had happened 48 hours ago, quietly, through an aide who met Patrick in a corridor and handed him a sealed data card without a word of explanation. The card contained a formal vote commitment, signed, with a brief attached statement that said only, "The Telhari Mercantile Collective finds the documented record sufficient for declaration." The Mirati Elders representative had submitted a written position that morning. It was 12 words. It said, "Truth on the permanent record has always been the highest service of this council." 6 other species had committed, at various stages over the previous days, through various channels, in various ways, some formal, some indirect, some so oblique that Patrick had needed to consult a specialist in galactic diplomatic signaling to confirm they were actually commitments and not simply polite acknowledgments. The numbers worked. Caroline had run them again that morning. But she had also run them before other votes, in other hearings, on smaller matters, and she knew that numbers on paper were not the same as numbers in the moment. What she had not counted on, and could not have counted on, was what the Rithosai statement had opened. After the Rithosai spoke on the 3rd day, 2 more species had requested floor time. The first was a small, reclusive civilization called the Averneth, who communicated through color pattern displays and whose council seat had been largely symbolic for the past 30 years because they rarely had anything they wanted to say. The pattern they displayed, translated, described a biological sampling incident in their outlying system 19 years ago that they had never formally reported. It had involved their young. They did not say more than that. They did not need to. The second was the Surathi, whose representative was a tall, quiet being that Caroline had exchanged exactly 4 words within 11 years of attending the same sessions. The Surathi statement was also brief. It described a survey vessel that had entered protected Surathi space under a Vethkai commercial charter 62 years ago and returned with genetic material that had never been formally catalogued or repatriated. The Surathi had raised it once, in a committee session, and had been told it was under review. They had never heard another word. The chamber had changed on the 3rd day because the Rithosai had decided that watching another species say out loud what the Rithosai had never said was more than they were willing to do in silence. And when the Rithosai spoke, the others understood they were not alone. That was the thing about silence. It felt like protection until you saw someone else step out of it and remain standing. Vorith had spent the 4th day in emergency closed sessions with his delegation and their legal team. Caroline had received 3 formal requests for bilateral talks, which she had declined, not out of hostility but because she understood what they were, attempts to move the conversation off the public record. She was not moving anything off the public record. The record was the point. Prethsovan had submitted a written appeal to the council chair requesting a delay in the vote for further deliberation. The chair had denied it on procedural grounds. The emergency arbitration framework did not permit delays once the opening statement had been entered into record and witnesses had been called. The vote proceeded. Caroline sat still and kept her hands flat on the table, the same way she had stood at the podium on the first day. The council chair, a being from a species called the Velasa who communicated primarily through vibration patterns and who translated as what Caroline could only describe as profoundly neutral in all things, read the declaration aloud through the central system. The Vethkai governing dynasty of the 7th Conclave is formally declared responsible for a documented violation against 11 human children, protected beings under the Council's provisional species provisions, aboard the registered human installation known as Meridian Station. It continued. It named the children by age. It named the date. It named the location of the footage in the permanent archive. It was specific in the way that only permanent things needed to be specific. Then the vote opened. It was not instantaneous. Each delegation transmitted individually, sequentially, in the long ceremonial tradition that the council maintained even for simple matters, and that for a vote like this felt, Caroline thought, exactly right. The slow accumulation of decisions made one by one had a weight that a simultaneous tally would have lacked. The commitments came in. Telhari, in favor. Mirati, in favor. Averneth, in favor. Surathi, in favor. Species after species, 17, 23, 40, 60, the number climbing, and Caroline kept her hands flat on the table and did not let herself count out loud. There were 2 dissents. 3 abstentions. 1 delegation submitted a blank, which the system counted as a 4th abstention. The rest were in favor. The declaration passed. The chamber's central display held the result for 30 seconds, by tradition, so that every delegate could record it into their own systems. Caroline looked at it. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had been prepared for relief, or satisfaction, or the clean, sharp feeling of something finished. What she felt instead was quieter than any of those. It was something close to the feeling of setting down something heavy after carrying it a long time, not joy, exactly, but the absence of a particular weight. A heaviness she had not realized, until it lifted, she had been carrying since she first watched that footage at 3 o'clock in the morning and understood what she was seeing. Patrick put a cup of tea on the table in front of her without being asked. She picked it up. Across the chamber, Voritha's containment sphere was still. The slow, breathing pulse that the Vethkai used as passive communication had gone quiet. Vorith had been in this chamber for 300 cycles. He had seen things survive and fail and be rebuilt. He was doing, Caroline recognized, the same calculation she had done before she came here, measuring what had just become permanent against what might still be salvaged. She understood that calculation. She did not envy him. Prethsovan caught her eye across the chamber. He was younger, and he was calculating differently, not what was lost but what could still be shaped. He was the future of whatever the Vethkai chose to become after this, and he knew it, and she could see him knowing it. She gave him a small, single nod. He returned it. That was not forgiveness. It was not an opening for easy repair. It was an acknowledgement that the record existed now, and they were all going to live in a world where it existed, and what each of them chose to do in that world was still, as it always had been, their own decision to make. Patrick was at her elbow. Ready to go. She looked at the declaration on the display for one more moment. Yes, she said. She picked up her things, and she left the chamber, and she went to Meridian Station. Danica Osei was sitting up in her hospital bed when Caroline arrived. She was wearing a blue hospital gown and had a bandage on her left arm and was in the middle of an argument with a nurse about whether she needed to stay connected to the monitoring equipment for another 6 hours or whether she could take a break. She was, by all visible measures, completely herself. The nurse won the argument and left the room, and Danica looked at Caroline with the direct, undecorated look of a child who had decided, apparently in the last 12 days, to dispense with the normal social filters that most people took years to develop. "You're the ambassador," she said. It was not a question. "I am," Caroline said. "My name is Caroline." "I know," said Danica. "My mom showed me pictures." Caroline pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down. She took off her diplomatic credentials. She had started doing that, she realized, when she was around people she did not want to perform for. Danica studied her with the particular attention of someone who had recently had reason to pay close attention to the people around her and had decided to keep doing it. "Did you do something?" Danica asked. "Yes." "What did you do?" Caroline thought about how to answer this. She thought about the 340-page document and the unbroken parked in a shipping lane with its lights on and the Telhari walking out of the chamber and the Rithosai speaking for the first time in 46 sessions and the vote and the declaration and the words now permanent in the council's archive. She told Danica all of it. She used simple words. She did not condescend, because Danica was not a person who responded well to condescension. This was obvious within the first 30 seconds. She told her about the footage, and the council, and the legal document, and the other species that had come forward. She told her about the vote. Danica was quiet while she listened. She was the kind of quiet that meant she was processing, not the kind that meant she was waiting for a pause to speak. She listened the way someone listens when they understand that the information matters. When Caroline finished, Danica was quiet for a moment longer. "Will they do it again?" she asked. "Those aliens. Will they do it to someone else?" "The specific people who made this decision," Caroline said carefully, "will face consequences for a very long time. The record means that anyone who looks at the Vethkai 7th Conclave dynasty in 100 years, or in 500 years, will see what was documented. They will know what was done. They can't change that. They can't remove it. It will be there." "But what about other ones?" Danica said. "Other aliens. Other kids." Caroline looked at her. She thought about what to say, and she decided that honesty was the only answer worth giving to someone who had already experienced what it felt like to be treated as less than a person. "I cannot promise you that no one will ever try to harm any child anywhere in this galaxy," she said. "I cannot make that promise because I don't know if I can keep it, and I think promises you can't keep are worse than no promises at all. What I can tell you is what changed." Danica waited. "The Rithosai have been a council species for over 1,000 years, Caroline said. They are old and careful and they are not a species that speaks without thinking for a very long time. Before what happened here, there were things that had happened to them, similar things, smaller things, that they had never reported. They had calculated that speaking would cost more than being silent. They had made that calculation over and over, for decades, and every time the answer came out the same." She paused. "Then they watched us speak. And they recalculated. And this time the answer was different." Danica looked at her. Her eyes were dark and sharp and full of something that Caroline thought was the beginning of understanding, not a comfortable understanding, not a simple one, but a real one. "So we were loud for them too," Danica said. It was not exactly what Caroline had said. It was better than what Caroline had said. "Yes," Caroline said. "Even though we didn't know it at the time. We were loud for them too." Danica thought about this for a long moment. She looked at the window of her hospital room, which showed the outer ring of Meridian Station and, beyond it, the clean dark of space with its scattered stars. "Is the Unbroken still parked out there?" she asked. Caroline smiled for the first time in what felt like a long time. "Captain Calloway moved it 2 days ago, once the legal review processes were formally confirmed. The parking spot was no longer necessary. Did they mind? The aliens. They minded quite a lot. Good, said Danica. Her voice was not angry when she said it. It was not satisfied, exactly. It was the voice of a child who had learned something true about the world, not something easy, but something real, and was deciding how to carry it. Caroline stayed for another hour. They talked about other things too. Danica had questions about what the council chamber looked like, and what the Telhari sounded like when they were walking out of a room, and whether the Mirati representative was as large as it looked in the pictures she had found in the educational database. Caroline answered all of them. She described the dim blue light of the chamber and the hum of the translation network and the sound of 4,000 delegates going completely silent while footage played on a screen. When Patrick appeared in the doorway with the quiet signal that meant they needed to move, Caroline stood and picked up her credentials. "Thank you for talking to me," Danica said. "Thank you for asking," Caroline said. She walked out of the hospital room and down the corridor and into the bright, ordinary noise of Meridian Station. People were moving through the corridors in the way people always move through stations, purposeful, slightly hurried, carrying coffee and reading messages and nodding to each other with the compact familiarity of people who shared a small world in a large space. She had a report to write. She had known that since she left the conclave chamber, and she had been carrying the shape of it in the back of her mind the whole journey here, the way she always carried unfinished documents. It would go into the council's administrative archive as an after-action account. It would be dry and formal and detailed. It would contain every decision she and Nora had made, every move the Unbroken had made, every procedural step and every vote count and every citation from Owen's 340-page document. It would be, in the language of her profession, comprehensive. But the last line of the report, she had known since the vote was read, was going to be the one true sentence she had been carrying since the morning she watched that footage and felt something in her become very, very still. Patrick walked beside her down the corridor. He was holding her coffee, which he had procured from somewhere while she was in the hospital room, because he always did and she never knew how. She took it. She thought about the report. She thought about Danica looking out the window at the stars. She thought about Vorith in his containment sphere, doing the calculation of what could still be shaped. She thought about Prethsovan, the future in a younger form, looking at the record and understanding that he would live in its world. She thought about the Rithosai, who had been silent for decades and had watched a young species speak, and had decided to recalculate. She thought about what it means to make a record. Not as punishment. Not as revenge. As history. As the refusal to allow the most important truths to be made comfortable by forgetting. She stopped at the end of the corridor, where a large viewing window looked out at the station's exterior ring and the field of stars beyond it. She stood there for a moment. Then she pulled out her communications device and opened the report. She wrote the last line first. Humanity does not forget who harmed our children. We simply decide, at our own pace, what to do about it. Today, we chose the record. The record will outlast us all. She filed the report. She drank her coffee. Outside the window, the stars were the same stars they had always been, ancient, indifferent, scattered across a galaxy full of civilizations that were still, for better and worse, learning what they were made of. Somewhere out there, the Unbroken was making its way back to standard patrol. Somewhere in the council archive, a declaration was sitting in permanent storage, time-stamped, signed, retrievable by anyone who looked. Danica Osei was awake. The record existed. That would have to be enough. And somehow, standing in that corridor with the stars outside the window and her coffee warm in her hand, it was.